Hi, everyone. Welcome to Nuclear Unknowns. My name is Margarita Osipian, and I'm part of the curatorial team for Sonic Acts. So during tonight's event, we're going to go down the complex path of radioactive pollution, exploring the subject's ecological, artistic, and geopolitical tangles. We're here in the streaming studio in Rotterdam with our wonderful live stream team, and we're really lucky to have our moderator for the evening, Kyveli Mavrokordopoulou, with us also physically in the space, which is always really nice. And our two speakers for the evening will be joining us virtually. So we can't all be together, but at least some of us can be, which is really great. So Nuclear Unknowns is our final event before the summer break, and it's a part of Night Air, which is a series of online transmissions that aims to make pollution visible by bringing forth the various side effects of modernity, from colonial exploitation of people and resources to perpetual inequalities brought about by destruction of the environment and common land. In other words, destructive capitalist practices that shape both our environment and human-nonhuman relations. So before coming into the live stream here, you also landed on a page and it gave you the option to either join us, as you are now, or to watch a film. And this time we actually are going to be screening 3 films as part of our program. And all these films engage with the nuclear across landscapes and chronological time. The first film is Crossroads by Bruce Conner, which features 37 minutes of extreme slow motion replays of the Operation Crossroads Baker underwater nuclear test at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific on July 25, 1946. Operation Crossroads was the name of the first 2 of 23 nuclear weapons tests the United States conducted at Bikini between 1946 and 1958. Both tests involved the detonation of a weapon with a yield equivalent to 23 million tons of TNT, the same as the atom bomb dropped on Nagasaki. More than 700 cameras and approximately 500 camera operators surrounded the test site. Nearly half the world's supply of film was at Bikini for the tests, making these explosions the most thoroughly photographed moment in history. Crossroads was also shown in 2013 during Sonic Acts, the Nuclear Sublime program. So we're really happy to be able to screen it again. Also on the live stream and in its new 4K restoration. The second film that we're screening is Uranium Hex by Sandra Lakier, which deals with uranium mining in Canada with a particular focus on women's work and the destruction of the environment. Lakier was a radical lesbian feminist experimental filmmaker who was one of the most prominent and inspiring figures of the London experimental film scene in the 80s and 90s. The film is part of a trilogy of films on radiation that Lakier made in the 80s. And it uses a kaleidoscopic array of experimental techniques such as superimposition, refilming, changes of speed, pace, and elaborate layering of sounds. The film is set in Northern Ontario and makes visible the invisible menace of nuclear industrialization, radioactivity, and uranium mining, or yellow cake, as it's colloquially known. The people, women's work, and their bodies, both the bodies of the miners and the First Nations people, the environment and natural resources all bear the scars of this kind of industrialization. And our final film that we're screening is We Have Always Known the Wind's Direction by Anais Halabi. The film has an outward subject and an inward one. Via gear-shifting combination of conversation, interview, and expressive location footage, it probes the possible burial of nuclear waste in the south of the West Bank. But as the footage cycles between fragmented conversations with a nuclear physicist and landscapes that are uneasily underscored by what we hear, and sometimes tinted an ill-omened red, another context emerges. The isotope, cesium-137, invisible but deadly, could be seen as a synecdoche for a more ungraspable invisibility, the systemic networks of power and control in the region, and this work as a meditation on how to account for the unfilmable but inexorable. So these 3 films are playing now, one after the other, and in 1-hour cycles. So if you come right on the hour, then you'll be able to watch all 3 in a row. And then they're going to be playing, they've already been playing for a few days now, but they're going to be playing until Wednesday at midnight, Central European Standard Time. So if you haven't seen them yet, you still have another 24 hours or so to watch them. So during the course of tonight's program, we invite and encourage those of you who are watching to have discussions via the live chat. Mirna is going to be moderating the chat, and she's going to relay your questions to Kyveli so that Kyveli can then bring them into the conversation that will take place after all of the talks are finished. So if you have a question and please ask it. And if it's specifically for a certain person, please also specify that so we can direct it to the right person. And now I'm really happy to pass the stage over to Kyveli Mavrokordopoulou, who's going to be moderating tonight's program, and who'll also begin our evening with an introduction on the topic in relation to her own PhD research. So Kyveli is an art historian and curator who's currently finishing a PhD focused on the subterranean, imaginary, and contemporary art, especially concerning nuclear spaces. She's contributed to various projects about nuclear technologies, like the interdisciplinary event series Nuclear Waste Weeks. She's also co-edited Kunstlicht, Nuclear Aesthetics with Ruby DeVos. And she currently teaches a seminar on art and nuclearity at the École Supérieure d'Art du Nord Pas de Calais/Dunkirk with Agnes Vilette, who's also one of the speakers for tonight. And her and Agnes are also working on a series of toxic tours across nuclear infrastructures in France. So welcome, Kyveli. I'd like to pass it over to you.
So, good evening, everyone. Now everyone can hear me. I hope so, or morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I know there are some familiar faces in the air with us right now. Thank you all for being with us. I want to warmly welcome you to a very special evening, Nuclear Unknowns, where we will discuss radioactive pollution through multiple angles with two incredibly insightful guests, artist and researcher Agnes Vilette and independent curator Jason Waite, that I will be introducing in more detail before their respective talks. As Margarita said, I will be your moderator for tonight's panel, and I'll take you through the discussion and the subsequent Q&A. But before I start, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to the Sonic Acts team for hosting this event and making it technically possible, and also for screening these very beautiful films for a few days that some of you might have already seen already. I wanted to begin with some reflections on the choice of the films and on the moniker Unknown. So why unknowns? We thought of this title as it refers to the camouflaged or obscured character of some of the places that we will be thinking about tonight. In my own work, in my PhD, I look at the nuclear underground, which is a par excellence unknown, unseen, and often inaccessible, yet intensely exploited space by atomic technologies. And I'm particularly interested in how contemporary artists are attempting to access such unknown spaces and establish different strategies of knowledge production around those same spaces that resist and come against, in a sense, official political scientific narratives that establish a form of alternative nuclear epistemologies. Tonight, we will also be talking about such places, inaccessible and invisibilized unseen spaces like the Fukushima exclusion zone, which will be the topic of Jason Waite, one of our speakers tonight, or like one of the most highly nuclearized and largely inaccessible sites in Europe, La Hague in France, where the research for the first French atomic bomb was carried out, that Agnes Vilette will delve into more detail. In the films, you can also see uranium mines in Canada, another nuclear unknown for way too long, one could say, or even secret nuclear waste disposal sites in the West Bank. So the central question for tonight will be how can we take up the challenge and devise strategies that attend to this invisibility, inaccessibility, secrecy, and indeed to the often unknown effects of such nuclearized and radioactive places. I wanted to start this short introduction with a quote by diasporic Guinea writer Lou Cornum, who wrote a very beautiful essay entitled The Irradiated International, an essay about landscapes and indigenous communities affected by or connected to the legacy of nuclear weapons. So Cornum says, where one violence occurs, the smoke caused obscures another somewhere else. Bombs, borders, the border as a bomb backdrop into people's lives and all the deadly effects lingering. So I wanted to start the talk with this quote because I think it provides us with a form of nuclear lexicon to start thinking about the effects, deeply unequal, of nuclear contamination and pollution. If it begins with a bomb, it doesn't stop to this kind of archetypal image of the atomic age. It also talks about borders, about bombs as borders, and about the longevity of nuclear materials, lingering. It allows us to think about the temporality of radiation that I think we will go over in more details with our two speakers tonight, about the slow violence of radiation and its geopolitical ramifications and the often unknown connections between disparate nuclear geographies. So the three films that accompany tonight's event also start with this archetypal image of the bomb without stopping there, however. We start in the Pacific Ocean in the 40s with Bruce Conner's Crossroads, Operation Crossroads. We see this kind of ultimate image of nuclear catastrophe, that is the blast from the underwater atomic explosions. But as I said, tonight we'll be looking at less direct, more cryptic or subterranean nuclear images and narratives. So in many ways, the film also does much more than just show us the image of the bomb. It's a film also about nuclear containment, the containment of nuclear fallout, but also the containment of the social, but perhaps also the sexual fallout of the nuclear age itself. So here I'm thinking about the discursive coupling of the bomb and female sexuality during the Cold War, and how this in the end speaks to how the atomic project indeed affected the management of bodies, which brings me to the end of the Cold War and the second film in our series, Sandra Lahar's Uranium Hex, that takes us all the way down to the Earth in the late 80s, 1987, I think, uranium mine in Lake Elliot in Canada. And the film is in many ways about this impossibility to contain radiation, the uncontainable nature of radiation. As Margarita introduces tonight, it's about the deadly effects of uranium mining, especially in women's bodies, where the bodies in this film become a metonym for something much broader, a much broader violence that describes an embodied vulnerability to violences that are not only environmental, but also technological and the violence of patriarchy. So it's the late 80s, and the film offers an intersectional reading of the nuclear, in a sense, connecting to different yet related struggles, that of feminism and the anti-nuclear movement. And I believe one could say that it's kind of a tipping point. It signals a tipping point for our thinking about the nuclear. As uranium mining for way too long has been a nuclear unknown, and even if it has been an activity that accompanied the atomic project from scratch, it was never recognized as nuclear as such, or quite late, let's say, in nuclear history. It's a history of systemic invisibilities, where radiation's physical invisibility facilitated the invisibility of uranium's deadly effects. Which brings me to the last film in our series. We have always known the wind's direction by Ines Halabi, which takes us to the nuclear present in 2019 in the West Bank, in which the catastrophe is no longer bombastic, but rather slow and invisible. So the film proposes this potential burial of secret nuclear waste in the West Bank, and begs the question of how the physical invisibility of radiation allowed and facilitated a political invisibility or a public imperceptibility of a violent oppression. It's about how the same invisibility reinforced and keeps reinforcing in many places around the world colonial inequities, and it circles all the way back to the quote with which I started this talk by Luke Hornum about the unequal distribution of toxicity and the violence of secrecy or of not knowing. So tonight, I hope we will be able to think about the importance of the politics of not knowing, or the politics of knowledge production, that in many ways are at stake in the nuclear places that we will be talking about. The social conditions that affect the production of knowledge about the ravages of nuclear accidents. how have we come to know what we know, for example, about radiation health effects after nuclear catastrophes? How is this knowledge produced? How does it circulate? Who suppresses it? Who hides it from public view? In turn, what social mechanisms guarantee that this knowledge is adequate and socially just? Who has access to that knowledge? And something that both our speakers will be broaching tonight, what is the role of art in this endeavor? Or to follow here anthropologist Kath Weston, can art seize the means of perception after a nuclear accident? Or maybe this sounds a bit too optimistic, an insight. Can art reveal the mechanisms that a race produce or willfully ignore the same knowledge? So in many ways, nuclear history is a history of repeated cover-ups and conflicting information that are still very much the case today. Which brings me to our first speaker for this evening, Agnes Vilette, that I'm very happy to introduce you to. Welcome, Agnes. So I have the pleasure to introduce you to Agnes Vilette, who is a PhD candidate at the Winchester School of Art. Her practice-based doctorate in nuclear aesthetic investigates the radioactive ruins of the Norman territory of La Hague. Agnes is also a freelance journalist with an art practice in photography. Trained in literature, she gained an agrégation in modern literature at Paris-Sorbonne and a master in art photography at London College of Communication. Previously, she has held teaching positions at Glasgow University, Queen Mary College London, and Winchester University, and currently works as a lecturer in visual culture at Cambrai Art School in the north of France. She's also developing 4 art projects at the intersection of photography, writing, and theory, such as the photographic series Alien of the Species that explores invasive insects and entomology, Beta Bunker that researches bunker architecture, Haunted, her PhD project about the Norman Peninsula, and its nuclear Cold War legacy that we will be also hearing more about in a few minutes. And finally, Landemer, which is a non-fiction novel based on a cold case that took place in 1969 in Cherbourg. Agnes, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, and very happy to be here tonight. And thanks, Kyveli, for the invitation, and Jason for the great company. I will be talking about some methodologies, some artistic methodologies of my doctoral project, and more specifically about 2 different rivers around La Hague. And the next slide will show you the word that I will be working from. And I don't know if the slide is coming. It's about liminality, which is a word that is very interesting to me. And I will start with an anecdote, but the following slide gives you a sort of like visual context for that anecdote. I will start with an anecdote that took place last January. As much as I knew it would eventually happen, it gave me an essential piece of information to understand the nuclear landscape of La Hague, and more importantly, to decipher the unease I keep feeling each time I approach the installation. To give you some context, and that would be the next slide and the one after, most probably the one after that one. Sorry, yeah, there's a map coming. So to give you some context, La Hague's nuclear cluster sits at the tip of the Norman Peninsula, 20 kilometers away from Cherbourg. It is known as one of the most nuclearized zones in the world, and it has 4 major installations that sit in a 25-kilometer perimeter. The oldest installation is Orano spent fuel refueling plant. Next to it, there is the Andras low to medium waste repository, also known as CSM, that's how they name it around there. Further south sits EDF electricity nuclear production plant at Flamanville. Then northwest towards Cherbourg, there is the nuclear propelled submarine construction plant. I regularly hang around the different sites since starting my doctoral project that investigate the radiotoxic landscape of La Hague. That day in January, standing still by the blowing Andras ventilation system, I was sampling sound. It was too late when I noticed the swift serve of the security inside the plant's perimeter. When I reached my car, I was told to stay put. The gendarmerie was coming, and my car plate had already been registered. Having been ID'd and asked many questions, the gendarme requested that I leave, claiming no one was allowed in the vicinity of the nuclear installations. Challenging their decision, I asked where the limits were. Where was the line I should not cross? I stood on public land, and no sign indicated that the outer plant's perimeter was forbidden to passerbys. Obviously, the gendarmes were unable to answer my questions. What their orders to leave were pointing to were the edges of the state. Fascinatingly, the gendarmes were delineating an invisible boundary I constantly felt without being able to identify it. The boundary has no clear contours, no fixed lines, no precise justification. Its edges coexist with the installation, they fold with the territory, they stand implicit, invisible, achieving an extra layer of invisibilization for the industrial military complex that started operating in 1966. That year, the initial site for spent fuel refueling was developed by the CEA, which chose that piece of land to build a twin site to Marcoule, based in the south of France. Both production units were charged with collecting plutonium for the atomic military program that started after World War II, as the goal retained nuclear technology and possessing the atomic bomb as the means to regain France's sovereignty and recognition from the Allied state after the country's 1940 defeat. The edges of the state loom large in La Hague, a liminal zone in its own right, and the coming slide, which is much more older than the one you're watching now, will give you a bit of another historical context. It's a liminal zone in its own right. The land was chosen for its secluded situation, for the underdeveloped rural setting of the territory, and for its inhabitants' known resilience, for an inherited trait of character known in local dialect by the adjective taiseux, which means those who don't speak, those who remain silent. More importantly, the peninsula was chosen for its strong wind, its access to large amount of water, and the nearby presence of the strong sea current of the Alderney Strait, a powerful current that runs between the Cape of La Hague and the Anglo-Norman island of Alderney. Wind, sea currents, secluded land, water were turned into environmental assets by the industrial complex, which releases important and controversial atmospheric and liquid waste. Twice in its history, La Hague was severed from the rest of the peninsula, its liminality used to the full, its geographic contours exploited to establish isolation and control. On this map, which is not that old, but you can see a line that crosses from north to south, kind of like delineating and cutting the tip of the peninsula from the rest. And it goes back to the Bronze Age, when between 1000 and 800 BC, a fairly unknown tribe built an elevated earthwork to protect itself from the rest of the territory. The inner border, known as the Hagdik, was later put to use by the Viking invasion. Then, and this is the following slide, during World War II, La Hague was turned into a secret military zone. Its inhabitants became passive residents of the plateau, where the German troops built extensive radar installation. What I'm getting at while I revisit the past is to underline that La Hague at a geographical, historical, but also, very importantly, symbolic level is defined as a zone long before the nuclear installation. It had been a secret zone where systems of concealment and surveillance were developed. In an uncanny way, and this is the coming slide, and this is a much more recent map, and that's very quite uncanny. The evacuation program in case of a major nuclear accident And that map was very recently updated, and that was in 2020. And it extended the exclusion parameter, moving it from 5 kilometers to 20 kilometers. And actually, it draws an exclusion zone that follows the same older boundaries, arguing that La Hague already constitutes a zone that intersects with layers of knowledge, toxicity, policing, surveillance, is a way to expose a geography of strata and thresholds within which the invisible realm of contamination is the ultimate layer. Different forms of sensing are necessary to approach La Hague's territory, where the slow violence of 55 years of nuclear activities have brought deep transformations. Unsurprisingly, the landscape one encounters is of an anticlimax. Small farms scattered around the hilly countryside, picturesque views of gazing fields, the quaint allure of small hamlet, the cliffs descending abruptly to the seashore. It is devoid of the edginess of disaster zone, of the nuclear sublime that is being commodified for dark tourism destination. In La Hague, radioactive contamination was pervaded through the slow violence of spills, leakage, accidental atmospheric gaseous release, airborne radioactive fallout, and radiotoxic isotopes entering the hydrological system. It confronts a different dynamic of invisibilization. The disquieting invisible toxicity combined with state control and censorship about the accident that took place. The liminality I'm interested in is informed by thresholds, that of toxicity, which requires calibrated system of sensing, as well as methods of investigating the invisible toxic legacy of the atomic French Cold War. The radioactive contamination in La Hague has generated an open secret, a secret hidden in plain sight. And the following slides insist and underline on another word which I'm really interested in. I mean, sorry, that's just the landscape. It's the following one. Sorry for these slides delay. The word I'm interested in is friction. And by friction, I address the numerous events that took place in La Hague, the micro accidents that disrupted the overwhelming official security discourse sustained by the plant's operator. Friction emphasizes how the uncertainties embedded in nuclear technology arise from the complex and lengthy line of scientific and industrial transformation, from uranium ore to reactors fuel to the reprocessing of some materials and the separation of what becomes waste to the incremental problematic of its storage. These complex industrial processes connect countries through trade. They also cross various jurisdictions that appeal to different security parameters and fall into social and political adjustment, such as such a vast industrial complex is constantly upheld by the possibility of the accident. Paul Virilio was insistent that, and this is a quote from him, so beginning of the quote, the riddle of technology is also the riddle of the accident, end of quote. For the French theorist, all technology produces and programs its own future accident. More so, war technology engages in a double negativity, that of what is produced and the inevitability of the accident. Both, he insisted, are hidden in the name of production and progress. In Bruce Conner's film that Kyveli introduced, Operation Crossroad, we are reminded that the whole nuclear industrial program has its origins in the bomb. Virilio insisted on exposing the accident, the failure, and the breakdown. In the 80s, pre-Chernobyl, Virilio imagined creating a new museography, and this is a second quote, a public platform for what never gets exposed, but exposes us endlessly to major accidents, end of quote. In his Museum of Accidents, the material remains have become evidence, the double negativity exposed in plain sight. And we can move to the other slide, which is the Andhra waste repository site that has a lot of connection with the work I will be talking about. To bring to visibility the hidden radiotoxic legacy in the zone, my project relies on system sensing that challenge the political invisibilization in place. And let's turn back to environmental assets, the one I mentioned earlier on, the wind, the sea current, the landscape around the plant, which are extensively requested to co-participate with the plant industrial procedures, such as disseminating toxic gaseous release in the atmosphere, diluting isotopic effluent with the help of sea currents, or even hiding contamination under the aspect of normality. As ecosystems, air and water are embedded in the industrial process, but also recipients of radioactive traces, what theorist Susan Shipley names material witness. And again, to go back to the first film, to Operation Crossroads, that film is really interesting because it links also to the era when knowledge about ecosystem was gained. Then, just in the follow-up to the detonation, funded by the military, ecological and biological research investigated nature's dynamics and worked at determining flora and fauna radiosensitivity. To do so, isotopes, due to their unique chemical signature, were used as tracers to penetrate the complex functioning of natural system. In La Hague, as the CEA and the Nuclear Cooperation archives remain inaccessible, and the next slides gives you also an example about even if the archive are accessible, even if data becomes open data, you will see it is heavily doctored, and often the information are hidden. This is a very recent document from 2018, and you can see that when it comes to precise numbers and data, it's totally missing and out of reach for researchers and NGO. So in France, the CEA archive, as well as the stakeholder nuclear plant, the documents and the archives are classified, and they are under a specific stamp, which is called the secret nucléaire. Therefore, I have to use other alternative archives. And the following slides give you an idea of the archive I'm using, and it's actually very useful. There are two alternative archives that I use to produce a counter history of the place. The first one is coming from a local NGO, which is called ACRO. And the following slide should give you a photograph of two of the volunteers going for their regular sampling of the rivers and the natural environment around the plants. ACRO has been monitoring the environment around the plant since 1986, and more importantly, the natural ecosystems, which I approach are the natural archives of successive accidents. For me, rivers, streams, marshland, and the sea keep traces of the spills. And the following slides show you that ACRO also monitors not only rivers, which are really important and have become important in my work, but also the sea, where a lot of effluent are released. One of the longest archive and richest archive is a tiny river, which is called the Sainte-Hélène. It's a tiny stream, which you will see in the coming slide. It's a very small stream, and it only flows for 2.7 kilometers before it reaches the sea. The stream has undergone several spills, which are reconfigured in an animation film recounting a timeline of all the accidents. And up to this day, the river is regurgitating long forgotten traces of past accident. And maybe I should slow down because the three coming, that's the Sainte-Hélène I'm talking about. And this is an aerial view where I've been monitoring. Following the river is part of what I'm doing. And this time it was done with using a Geiger counter from Safecast, which gives me after some data reading. And the following slides shows the river when it reaches the sea, and with a type of very different riparian flora. And the slides that comes after is directly connected to the film. So the slides can go while I speak. Up to this day, the river is regurgitating long forgotten traces of past accidents. The resurgences, as they are named, follow the cycle of hydrological modification, which depend on rainfall, season, cycle. As such, the river becomes the interface between hidden hydrological networks and the surface, where contamination can be isolated and identified. Therefore, the river tethers together several relational threads, offering the possibility to retrospectively match identified isotopes with past censored accidents. And you see here an example of the main accident which happened in 1976. And the following slides shows a much more recent accident that also happened in the same river, but this time with plutonium. These nuclear forensics, deeply reliant on water's ontology, permit to reconstruct the causes of the slow violence and pushes forward hypotheses to unveiling past accidents. There is a fascinating side to the Sainte Hélène, and I don't know if you remember the slide we saw previously. Its quiet and unassuming beauty is actually fake. Its source, situated underneath the refueling plant, was destroyed during industrial extension. What you see is an artificial river fed by effluents and rainwater collected on site. Water is inherent to the uncertainties of the nuclear industry. Its velocity, changeable nature, multi-scale materiality, morphing from water drop to an ocean, is the dynamic force of nuclear durational and spatial deteriorization. The Sainte Hélène carries and brings upwards pockets of contamination that have sometimes lay hidden and dormant in the underground for decades. Similarly, away from the security perimeter that prevents scrutiny, the river journeys towards open space, remapping the contamination in new toxic configuration. The Sainte Hélène's most problematic accident that took place in 1976 was caused by an overflow of tritium at Andhra Waste Repository. If reassuringly, levels of tritium have actually decreased in the last decades, tritium is a gaseous isotope, but it also announces heavier and slow isotopes that will resurface at some point. The coming slides moves to a a different spot, which I'm currently really working on. It's not very far from the Sainte Hélène, and it's a much tinier river, which is called the Rue des Landes. It's more of a stream. Rivers' ecosystem, particularly riparian flora and fauna, are alternative forms of archives. I'm investigating that tiny stream named the Rue des Landes, for which I'm currently developing a methodology for investigating another accident that took place on the 8th of January 1981. And what you see is the field actually. And the coming slide will show you where the stream ends up, and it comes up and ends up in a water place where animals can drink. In 1981, that night of January, these are just the spot. You can see this aerial view, so it's not such a great shot, but you can see the sampling points where ACRO conducts the result. And these results were provided in 2016, showing quite high level of radiotoxicity. And the following slide will give you, again, a sort of visual idea of where the stream comes up. And this was taken a few weeks ago. So in order to prevent the animal from drinking, they put these sort of pieces of string, which probably don't do anything much. But to go back to 1981, that night, for 48 hours, so it was on the 8th of January, 1981, for 48 hours, no one except for the plant's operators knew about the unraveling accident. It was later on classified at level 3 at the Anais atomic accident scale. The fire that developed at silo 130 took a whole day to be extinguished. The fire led to extensive atmospheric fallout that remained hidden at the time. That night, the wind blew northwest and brought down some of the contamination in a tiny field, the one you just saw on the images, outside of the perimeter of the plant. The only way to put down the fire was to soak the silo with 300 square meters of water. As the years passed by, an additional 800 square meters of infiltrated rainwater soaked the buried structure. Initially conceived as a temporary dry container, the silo became an invisible and dormant monolith, saturated with potential hazards. Engineers understood immediately that the containment would leak, but there did not exist any technical solution at the time, and even now, for retrieving the charred waste and the contaminated water. Seasons went by, dry summers succeeded humid winters, working at the soil around the silo, deep amidst the profound strata of the plateau within the layered porous schist geology of the land. Water dripped and journeyed deeper, reaching the aquifers that are lodged into rocks, interstices. To investigate the legacy of the accident, I'm using moss, and you will see some images in the coming slide of different plants that I will be using. There's not just moss, there is also brooms, but it's mainly moss that I will be working with. Moss is used in my project as a proxy, and I'm using it to map and narrate the slow violence of that small patch of land. In the coming days or months, and I'm still unsure about the date because the plant stakeholders, of course, don't say anything, but that around the stream and in that tiny field, they will conduct some operation to dig the surface of the soil. It could be now when I'm speaking, it could be in a few weeks or months. It's meant to happen at some point, and I guess this year. Some part of the field will be dug to retrieve the upper layer of soil. From the moment it is excavated, the soil becomes nuclear waste, entering a whole set of administrative and biopower status. Moss, but also brooms that you will see in the coming slide, are used as sensors as they fix isotopes but do not die from them. They function as filters that deliver data and help to reconstruct material evidence for the suppressed events. I'm using plants as media. Their rootless system, and especially the rootless system of moss, gorges on water when rain falls and then dries in summer, but it keeps absorbing and retaining the contamination. And the reservoir system that moss have developed is so specific. It can provide precise data that helps to identify concentration levels, types of isotopes, and their mapping. And this is coming here to some of the plants and the moss. Moss provides terrain knowledge and is turned into a sensor. Working, and I'll conclude with that, working with plants open up with new perspective for apprehending the toxic landscape. As receptors, sensors, and bioindicators for radioactivity, moss also invites us to think and reflect on how to live with toxicity and inhabit a radioactive landscape. And thank you very much for your attention. And sorry for the slides, thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnes, for this very insightful talk. And I think this kind of material, natural ethnography of the toxic landscape you just described is already opening up a lot of questions about invisibilities and systemic invisibilities that we will also be talking about with our next guest for tonight, that I'm very happy to introduce you to. Jason Waite, an independent curator. Hello, Jason. Who will be speaking to us about his curatorial work with the Don't Follow the Wind collective. So Jason Waite is an independent curator and cultural worker focused on forms of practice producing agency. Recently working in sites of crisis amidst the detritus of capitalism, looking for tools and radical imaginaries for different ways of living and working together. He is part of the collectives Don't Follow the Wind and This Useful Time Machine. He has co-curated exhibitions at Palais de Tokyo, the Kitchen, Art in General, and Casco Art Institute, where he was also curator. And tonight he will be speaking to us about his work with Don't Follow the Wind, about which I will also give you a few information, facts before Jason takes over. So, Don't Follow the Wind is a long-term international project. It takes the form of an ongoing exhibition inside the restricted Fukushima exclusion zone. The area comprising parts of 7 towns that were forcibly evacuated in the wake of the 2011 disaster due to radioactive contamination from the meltdowns at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, separating residents from their homes, land, and community. They have been developing with a collective new works by 12 participating artists that are installed in the zone at multiple sites that were lent by former residents, all of which are contaminated and were evacuated immediately after the disaster. As the zone remains inaccessible to the public, the exhibition remains largely invisible, only to be viewed in the future when the ban on entering the area is being lifted. So Jason, I pass it to you now.
Thank you so much, Kyveli. And thank you for the great introduction. And also, I'm very much looking forward to the conversation this evening. And it was such a rich presentation by Agnes and so many concepts, which I look forward to hopefully getting time to unpack together. In addition, I'd like to thank Sonic Acts for the invitation, for Margarita, and for everybody behind the scenes and all the Wizard of Oz's that are making this transmission possible. And thank you all for being indoors on a summer evening and sharing that with us. I am part of the collective of Don't Follow the Wind, as Kyveli mentioned. And personally, as a form of introduction, I think Kyveli laid out very well two of the many problematics that we face in Fukushima, and with nuclear contamination much larger, is that of forcible displacement of communities. And the second of which being the unique durational capacity of the radioactive isotopes. And it's in that latter duration that we actually started working together as a collective. So we started working and thinking about Don't Follow the Wind, not immediately after the triple meltdowns of March 11th, 2011, but actually a year and a half later, when the news of the disaster was starting to decline. Residents were still displaced at the time, not receiving compensation, not adequate compensation, and contamination of the environment was ongoing, as it still is today. Personally, in 2012, I was in New York City working as a curator in the aftermath of the uprisings of the Arab Spring, Occupy, and Hurricane Sandy, which struck the city and which a number of cultural workers were involved in responding to. I met the Tokyo-based collective Chimpom in New York. They had previously worked in Fukushima, and looking in the after effects of disaster and different ways of working culturally in a response to those disasters, we started to think about what a long-term project in Fukushima could be, and how art could potentially have the capacity to work on different levels to respond to such disasters. I'd like to tell you about my first trip to Fukushima. This was in April of 2013, the following spring. I arrived in Tokyo and we heard news that a section just outside of the Fukushima exclusion zone became accessible to the public to view the spring cherry blossoms, despite the low level of contamination in the area. So what you're looking at is a news broadcast of various media outlets who were invited to share images and invite the public to come and visit the cherry blossoms. So we decided to take them up on the invitation and drive the next morning. When we started to arrive in the area, unlike the images, we didn't see anybody. We didn't see news crews. We didn't see any other visitors. Instead, we saw black bags of low-level radioactive waste. And these are containing debris that is being collected and incinerated and then buried in the ground. And at the time, there was just piles of bags alongside the road. When we finally got to the place of the cherry blossoms, it was completely vacant, except for the signs on the trees. And those signs read, "In this area, the radiation level is high. When you view cherry blossoms, please stay inside of the car. Thank you for your cooperation." And this message underscored a normative dissonance in the area, where normally the tradition would be to visit cherry blossoms and to picnic underneath the trees and to enjoy their blossoms with friends and family and others. And instead, one is asked to go to the area, and yet there is very strong recognition of the potential dangers and being asked to stay in one's cars. So this normative dissonance between, in one way, the messaging that's going on around Fukushima and around nuclear disasters, much broader, and then the reality on the ground and how there's a disconnect between the two. Driving down that street, we ran into this gate. And this gate was the border of the Fukushima exclusion zone. As you can see, the border of the exclusion zone is consisting of a movable gate, one which is open, porous, which allows air to go through, an access which can seem arbitrary. In this case, the gate bisects a parking lot, and if one continues that line to the right, this would enter into a shopping center. And if one continues the logic of a zone where one can't enter and a zone where one can enter, that logic would bisect a shopping center, albeit closed. It seems one could enter half of a shopping center, but the other half would be considered radioactively contaminated and dangerous. So this porous nature underscores the logic of separation and the very strange notion of what it means to have borders around an area, and also highlights the fact that radiation itself is borderless and can easily traverse these borders. This is a map of the exclusion zone itself. On the left, you can see that it's located about 200 kilometers north of Tokyo in Fukushima Prefecture. And it's a small area of Fukushima Prefecture along the coast. And the area shaded on the right is 337 square kilometers, which, as Kyveli mentioned, takes up a part of 7 towns. And the pattern of the Fukushima exclusion zone is shaped by the wind itself. So it was the fallout starting around March 11th and continuing, which was blown largely, not only, but largely in a northeasterly direction, or northwesterly direction, sorry. And it would be the contours of the wind blowing, buffeted by the mountains at one end, which would make the distinction of the zone. So Don't Follow the Wind, as a title, actually comes from one of our collaborators and a former resident of the area. And this is an image that he drew of his impression of the meltdown, both expanding into the atmosphere and continuing into the ground. And his experience is encapsulated in the title. Soon after March 11th, it was very unclear what the extent of the disaster was. And he got a call from a friend who worked inside the power plant. And his friend told him that it was much worse than the media was saying, and that he should evacuate immediately with his family. So he gathered them up and started driving north initially. Yet he was a hobby fisherman and a hobby sailor, so he understood how the wind worked and what his proximity to the plant was. And he actually stopped the car and got out and checked the wind, and realized that the wind would be blowing all of the radioactive material north of his location. So he immediately turned around and drove south, taking himself and his family to relative safety. And what his experience meant for us was not only how the importance of rumor became requalified, whereas rumor, or an alternative form of sharing information, which can largely be seen as pejorative, in this case was extremely important, and how rumor filtered through networks of friendship and camaraderie were very meaningful to us. On top of that, how his everyday skills, that being a sailor, during a time of crisis became something extraordinary. And we thought about culture and art at that same moment, of how culture and art could shift from being something to ordinary extraordinary, and trying to think about how Don't Follow the Wind could operate within that nexus. So working with him, along with other former displaced residents who loaned us their homes and places of work, we were able to gather multiple sites inside the radioactive zone, where we invited 12 artists listed here: Ai Weiwei, Aiko Miyanaga, Chimpam, Grant Ginyo Mirai, Nicholas Hirsch, and Jorge Otero Pailos, Kota Takeuchi, Eva Franco Mates, Meru Koizumi, Nobuaki Takagawa, Ahmed Ut, Trevor Paglin, and Taryn Simon, to come and make new works inside these various homes and places of work, which would open on March 11th, 2015, the 4th anniversary of the disaster. And the curatorial collective Don't Follow the Wind, of which I am part of, which also includes Kenji Kubota and Eva and Franco Mates, along with Chimpam, we officially opened the exhibition on the 4th anniversary, and the works are installed there waiting to be seen. And the question came up very quickly of how to think about communicating the project, and in particular, communicating in a project that could confront the durational capacity of the radioactive isotopes. And we decided that we would follow the conditions of radioactivity itself. So as opposed to thinking about the visibility of the works, perhaps works which could be seen as we've seen so many images and easily consumed. What would it mean for a project to remain largely invisible? And how, if that project was invisible, could it work in other ways on people's imaginations in a way which is not temporally fixed, and in a way which could contest the long-range duration of the disaster itself? So this is the website, which still exists today. And the website consists of a short audio piece of all of the artists and cultural workers and the collective speaking about the project. And so in a way, it exists as a community, and in a community without image which we each need to make for ourselves. That being said, in this context where we're able to have a conversation, I would like to share 3 of the works as examples for how the works can work on us and hopefully continue to work on us. And I would like to start with Trevor Paglen, who deals with what Agnes mentioned, Susan Shipley's concept of material witness, and how the material witness of radiation itself can not only bear a certain form, but what happens when, in a certain sense, the bookends of the radioactive project can come together in one space. And Trevor Paglen brought trinitite from the United States. And trinitite was a man-made material which was first formed after the first nuclear explosion, the Trinity test in the New Mexico desert. And this first test created such a strong force that fragments of the bomb mixed with the sand and created a new glacious material called trinitite. And he brought this very beginnings of the nuclear project to Fukushima and mixed it with glass from broken windows from the surrounding area. And these 2 materials sit merged in juxtaposition inside the zone in a cube entitled Trinity Cube. And this cube reminds us not only of the durational capacity of the radioactive isotopes, but also of the histories and the responsibilities around the nuclear project itself. Second work I'd like to discuss is by Ai Weiwei, entitled A Ray of Hope. And inside the zone, there's no water, there's no electricity. The entire zone is largely dark, as the houses and buildings don't have any power. So for one of the 2 projects Ai Weiwei developed for Don't Follow the Wind, he had installed a solar panel inside on top of a house and 2 lights inside that house. And it's set up so the lights go on 2 times a day inside the zone. Early in the morning, when the residents who are forcibly displaced would be there, and in the evening, when they would be coming back home. And for Ai Weiwei, this notion of time and regularity became very important. How could we think about artwork holding a time and holding a place when those residents can no longer be there, or when we can no longer visit? And in that sense, not only do we understand the artwork as a regular presence, but how do we understand that artwork as expanding out into our own minds at different moments in time? So while we might not hear about news of Fukushima or of the radiation levels at the moment, we can know that twice a day, this light is turning on, waiting for other lights to get brighter and for the zone to come back to life at some point in time in the future. The final work I'd like to speak about is by the artist Meiro Koizumi. And Meiro worked with a displaced resident and filmed him for many hours inside his present home, where he's been displaced outside of the zone, and inside his old home inside the zone. And out of these many hours of interviews, Koizumi chose one 3-minute segment. And it was a 3-minute segment where he asked the resident to imagine what it would be like to return home that first time that he re-entered his home. And the resident imagined a story wherein he would come into his home and his wife had just cooked dinner and they're sitting down and the soup that they're eating has a special taste and they're recognizing that taste. And as they sit on the dining room table, his wife mentions that she would like to return the next day, meaning she would like to leave their house inside the zone, or what wouldn't be the zone in the future. And he thinks about this, and he ultimately agrees. And this short 3-minute excerpt plays on headphones in front of his house inside the zone. And this imaginary for Koizumi not only speaks about the multiple overlapping times of Fukushima, but it also speaks about the conflicted notion of what it means to return home. What does it mean to return to a place that is contaminated for decades, if not longer? What does it mean to return to a place that looks as such, as you can see in the image? And in 2018, when the work had been installed there for 3 years, the government gave an ultimatum to residents to decide whether they wanted to destroy their homes or not. And if they chose within a short window, the government would demolish their homes for free. And so without being able to know what the future would be for the zone, or when even the zone might reopen, or when they might even be able to live in their homes again, or what state those homes might be in, they were asked to make a decision on their future. And this resident ultimately chose to demolish his home, which is the image you're looking at. And I bring this to speak about the present day, when at the moment there's now less than 3% of the zone that has reopened for the first time. Residents aren't able to move back yet, but they can gain access for 24 hours a day. And while there's not necessarily a timeline for the entire zone to reopen, the initial imaginary that Don't Follow the Wind began to work on is drastically shifting and changing. And besides the notion of change within the landscape, there's also a change within who inhabits that landscape. In particular, this is an image of a wild boar from just outside of one of the sites. And wildlife has increased greatly in the area, as well as the wild boar. And so unexpectedly, in the project, we've also had our first visitors, which turned out to be non-human visitors in the figure of these boars, who have not only come to visit, but also participated in the project in various ways. This is one of the sites, and this is the destruction that the boar made in the entrance, as it evidently couldn't gain access So it tried to bully its way in to the site and ultimately did gain access to the exhibition. And there's a question and consideration now of how, of not necessarily protecting the work in the exhibition as we do, but also how to accommodate and how to live with our non-human visitors and non-human inhabitants. So in closing, I would like to just talk about one concept which really resonates with our struggles. And that's this notion by Astrida Nemes and Rachel Lowen Walker of a non-chronological duration. And for us, in the project, we know we're not in the beginning of the nuclear disaster, and we know we're not at the end. So we recognize we're somewhere in the middle, even though that middle is not necessarily one timeline, but that middle is a whole host of timelines, and which are ongoing, some of which were imagined, and some of those timelines have already ended without that imaginary being complete. And this notion of non-chronological duration for us is important to think about how the artwork can work over time. So thinking through the timelines of the artworks being developed from 2012 to 2014, installed in 2015, sitting there now, Tuesday, June 22nd, 21. What is the time of the artwork? And when does that artwork work? So is it in its capacity at the time it was first installed? Is the artwork working now while we're sitting here with one another and we can't access it? Will the artwork be working in the future when and if we're able to visit the projects? And in contrast to the decay of the radioactive isotopes, and in particular it's cesium-137 on the land around the area. And it's the cesium-137 which has a half-life of 30 years, which means by 60 years, the energy of that isotope will have diminished completely. So while entropy is built into the project, and while the radioactivity is depleting, is the artwork depleting? Or rather, is the artwork maintaining its full capacity at all of these moments? And with this full capacity, we hope that these artworks can hold not only the space, as many of the residents believe who are displaced from their homes, that the artworks are there instead of them, but we hope that it can also hold you and us there, especially in the moments when we perhaps don't hear about Fukushima, when we don't understand what's going on. And we hope that this non-chronological duration can continue beyond this moment and perhaps interrupt our thoughts. So with that, I'd like to invite you both to partake in this holding and partake in a very different imaginary of Fukushima, and also potentially at some point in time in the future, join us in Fukushima. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jason, for this incredibly beautiful talk. I think that both contributions this evening gave us a lot of like a lexicon to start thinking through the peculiar, invisible, and violent ways radiation operates through. So I'd also like to invite Agnes to join us for the Q&A. And in many ways, I feel like both of you today talked a lot about getting access to things, getting access to places, getting access to information, getting access to people to speak to, getting access to homes. And I wonder if it's perhaps an apt way to start this conversation by maybe each of you giving us a few thoughts on the methodologies of your work. So perhaps Agnes could speak about how all these different layer of information you provided us with, from the geological, water, archive, citizen science project. How does all this come together? And perhaps Jason, you could talk about this necessity. I don't know, you didn't speak about it in these terms, but that's how I see it. This necessity to work in a collectivity, to work with others that are not only artists, but I would also see the people you came in discussion with who had to leave the zone as also participants in the project in a sense. So maybe we could start with this question of your methodologies of work in these two very specific geographical nuclear areas. Maybe we can start with Agnes.
Sure, yeah, and thanks, Jason. It was very poignant, and it really bounces back with what I was talking about, and and there was one element that I just wanted to underline. Japan had a lot of trade contract with La Hague, so there was quite a lot of connection, and La Hague still at some point retained some waste for the Japanese. So there are these sort of bizarre network that are twisted between nuclear plants and histories. And to come to Kyveli's question, what I was actually, there's a word that came recently, or I mean more an expression that became sort of a methodology in the most recent month. It was it's relational threats. I felt really quite isolated and being cut from direct access to knowledge and to archives meant that I had to go other ways and find alternative means to get what I wanted or what I was looking for. And one of the things that started unraveling was the sort of like tiny conversation that were started at different points between different interlocutors, them being the the citizen scientist people, or other people. Was like as I realized after a while that I was sort of meshing the place. I was making a connection, constant connection. And to go back to the very precise project about the moss, to identify the moss, I needed help. And of course, I am not a botanist myself. So I had to bring two French botanists to the landscape. And I realized that by doing that and by talking to them, there were like new connections that were being made and new access to knowledge. And it would bounce back on other interlocutors. And La Hague, as I have kind of pointed to, is a very tiny sort of place where everybody sort of knows everybody. And again, that unravel new connection. So in order to kind of fight, and it's not a fight, but to really bypass the sort of difficulty to access information, I had to reconfigure how to find it, and therefore I was making other connections, and that at some point felt like that I was starting to have something consistent, by doing so.
Yeah, thank you, Agnes. Perhaps Jason, you could talk about your own, maybe the own hiccups and difficulties you've encountered yourself working with also a place that is very difficult to access, also just practically speaking, physically speaking, not only in terms of information. And yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And it's a really core part of our project, which is this actually mode of access. And that's very strange, especially when, as you've so eloquently underscored in your introduction, the fact that so much of the nuclear project is based on inaccessibility. So I didn't mention in the talk, but we access some of the sites with the former residents themselves. And not so long after the disaster, former residents were allowed to return home 15 times a year for a couple hours at a time. And that recently got expanded up to 30 times a year. And the government asks that you can return home with your white Tyvek suit, which they give to each resident or to everybody who goes in. And you can bring out some objects that have been inside your house, nothing that has been outside of your house, but you're able to bring home some personal objects, and those can also be checked at the border of the zone to check their degree of radioactivity or the lack thereof. And in other places, it's very strange, as with this borderless form of radiation, the access to sites is also dependent on the various towns. And in one of the towns where we have a particularly good relation, they consider us an organization for public benefit. Normally, organizations for public benefit are those that undertake cleanup or rehabilitation of houses or the like. But it's interesting thinking about culture as part of a common good for a place whose residents are not there, and the means of access that we're given. But we access not only for Don't Follow the Wind, but many times we're also accessing for those residents who are displaced, who live elsewhere, and picking up items for them. And so there's a whole mesh of maintenance which is involved, and one which at the beginning of the project we never imagined would continue in such an integral way, not only to Don't Follow the Wind, but also to our lives, in the sense of going there quite often, personally every couple months, for the last 6 years or longer now, and to continue indefinitely.
Yes, thank you, Jason. I think you mentioned the word that is very important in both of your practices, and in general, I would say in the role of art when we think about nuclear disaster, care and maintenance. And perhaps this can be a way to think about your work in these areas. So, Jason, I know that you do speak a lot about those terms also in the book you just co-edited about the project, without romanticizing the two concepts of maintenance and care. But I would like to hear more about how those terms are actually, pertain to labor, and if you could speak about the work that you do as a form of labor that cares and takes care of forcibly abandoned homes. And in many ways, Don't Follow the Wind activates those two terms at once as a theoretical framework, but also as an ethos, a methodology, a political cause. And I think this is quite an exciting line of inquiry we could take up. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about those two terms, Jason, and the two slippages between these two terms? You spoke about maintenance, not about care, but and how the slippages can become generative, and also maybe what is exactly care for in Don't Follow the Wind, in the sense that in many ways the collective navigates a paradoxical inside-outside, of which the middle ground is still a bit unknown. So what does it mean exactly to care for example, homes that will potentially never be seen or visited by their former inhabitants?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such a problematic and an ongoing struggle. Not only the notion of care for the structures and also for the artwork, but also for the inhabitants. And I'd be very curious from Agnes's experience as well. But at least in Fukushima, in this area, it was largely older residents who were there when the disaster happened. And so it is older residents or elderly who are displaced and who are now living elsewhere. And so the matrix of care shifts into the notion of elder care as well, and how these long histories in these places, how do we maintain a physical continuity with them through pictures, through stories, through repair, through their desires of what they would like done there, even though they're not there. And Silvia Frederici talks about this notion of the negative commons in an interview in the book. And in particular, she's thinking about a negative commons in relationship to how a disaster creates this problematic which brings together across class, across gender, those who need to come together to deal with this negative commons, in this case, waste. And I think, as Agnes mentioned, one of the problematics for nuclear waste and for Fukushima is the fact that it's not just the residents alone who can work towards various solutions. And in fact, this network, as Silvia Frederici says, needs to be expanded into co-opting, appropriating the nuclear industry, appropriating technologies or knowledge, undercommoning various forms of knowledge, so that not only can existence live, but that hopefully a very different future can come out of that existence as well.
Thank you, Jason. And I want to read one comment from the chat from Maria Mona Lisa Garavi, who said that relates actually to knowledge, since this is how you concluded your answer. And Mona Lisa says, regarding knowledge production through bombing, 2 days ago, actually, the US Navy detonated a 40,000 ton bomb that triggered a 3.9 magnitude earthquake in Florida, and called it a shock trial. So talking about a history of cover-ups, and also how all this different information is mediated, I think this is a very trenchant and topical example. And I'd like to take up more questions from the audience, I think. One for Agnes by Dries, who asks if you could go further into your interest in the word liminality.
Yes, yes, thanks for the question. Yeah, it's really about the idea of there's again, as Jason pointed to, even though there might be in Fukushima a border, very clear line from where, like that is limiting the access. Most of the nuclear territories don't have that very specific border, frontier, boundary. So the liminality is a sort of like slightly more vague, in the sense that it points to isolation and the sort of the notion of threshold. And I kept being intrigued by how each time I go there, I really have the feeling I'm entering some very specific area where codes, where information and things are not exactly what they seem to be. So the idea of liminality is also the fact that there are these different invisible boundaries that I keep crossing in and out while traveling around. And nothing is very securely fixed in that area, and everything is liminal. The perception of the inhabitants, the NGO work, the results that are interpreted different ways, either by the stakeholders or by the activists. Everything is really sort of movable, changeable. It constantly morphs and changes. It's very hard to kind of fix something at some point. And radioactive decay anyway never stops. It's that endless process of like an agency that is in the constant move and changes everything with it. So that liminality was not just about the idea of the border. And I was somehow, when I read a lot about the legacy of the American Cold War in the American desert, mainly in the Northwest, they really talk about sacrificial zone and sacrificial land. And I could really sort of like establish parallels between the French history and the American history, even though the landscapes look totally different. But there are similarities, there are elements, and the desert is a liminal space as much as the marshland, as much as the plateau, which is not very much populated in Ag. So this back and forth between ideas and places, yeah.
Thank you, Agnes. I will keep taking questions because we actually have quite a few of them. Now a question from Margarita. In relation to your talks, I've been thinking about Svetlana Alexiev's book, Voices from Chernobyl, and how the people impacted by the disaster did not know how to understand or think about the contamination of their environments. They were only able to relate to it to war. So in relation to invisibility, do we need to find a new language or new relations to speak about nuclear contamination? I feel that both your projects, in a sense, speak to this idea, like revisit, in a sense, this very much debated concept in nuclear aesthetics of invisibility in different ways. And maybe you could tell us how you deal with it in your respective work.
Do you want to start, Jason?
Sure. I think it's an interesting point, and it's an interesting point in terms of what our aesthetic underlying medium is meant to do in one way in the forms of representation. There was a displaced resident who we met in temporary housing that was set up by the town, and her only desire was that radiation would have color. If she knew everything that was contaminated was red and everything which was fine was green, then she could have the visual tools to navigate her world. And in a way, it feels like we can't offer that. In a way, it feels like the notion of what representation in art, in a certain sense, can do in the immediate sense, perhaps doesn't work in such a material way, although Hobley's film and the film series might contest that. And I think it's an interesting methodology that she comes up with in terms of seeing cesium and seeing radioactivity and how that overlaps with the landscape. But I guess the question is, how do we deal with the temporal dimension of radiation, and how can we deal with the invisible effects of radiation? In Fukushima, so much of the effects are actually mental effects. Suicides have been much higher than surrounding areas. There's all sorts of mental illness, and the first death attributed to TEPCO, to the company, Tokyo Electric Power Company, that owns the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, was an elderly woman who returned home and poured gasoline over herself and self-immolated. And the distress from being separated from her home, the court found, was strictly tied to the radioactive contamination. So how can we think about not only seeing radioactivity, but seeing the other facets and the other trials which radioactivity puts residents and others through.
Yes, thank you, Jason. And I read about this example in the book as well, and I was also quite in a sense, shocked to read this, because this is not something I have been reading about as the follow-up from a nuclear disaster. Usually what we see is a very different form of information. And Agnes, maybe you could also speak a bit more about these kind of facets that Jason just spoke to, but in this territory that is your research, La Hague, because I know that you also engage a lot with the local communities and the people who work in these infrastructures. And you also started your talk by telling us also a psychological characteristic, or kind of a nickname there. They call them like taiseux, so the people who don't talk a lot. So yeah, maybe you can tell us a bit more about this.
Yes, yeah, I can. The situation I encounter in La Hague is for me, quite peculiar. In the way that actually people don't really discuss so much the nuclear installation and their legacy. Is very strong forms of denial that also are very simply explained by the fact that it provides a lot of work. I mean, it's a mono industry. It's the main employer for the whole area, and in families, there's sometimes like 3 to 4 generations of like engineer or technician who have worked there. So to understand and to work on my doctoral project, I actually moved to Cherbourg because I knew that the only way to totally understand the area, and not just by researching it, but was to live over there and actually live very close to the arsenal where they are making the nuclear submarine, within the 2-kilometer perimeter exclusion zone they just like drew recently. And it's very difficult to talk about that. What people over there want to know immediately, they want to assess if you are anti or pro-nuclear. This is a very quick, it really immediately clicks in that they really want to see which side you're in. And it's very difficult to not answer on that point, or to really open the conversation in a different way. And what I was struck by is more the impossibility to really talk about it. And it's understandable when one knows the situation with France and nuclear industry. It has 56 working reactors at the moment. It's selling and still building the 3rd generation reactor, the EPR. And it's really trying to, at the moment, due to global warming, really emphasizing the importance of the nuclear industry and nuclear energy. So it's, for me, still very difficult to understand that most of the people in the area, and still in France as a majority, are really pro-nuclear. They don't have there's not much of a critical approach. There is one which is embedded in the activist NGO, which are still kind of active, but not as they used to be. And this is quite an important point as well, the fact that the historical activists who are now in their 70s or 80s and who have like a lot of knowledge, they have really followed not just the struggle with the plant and the plant stakeholders, but also a very deep knowledge about the accidents, the spills, the micro accidents that have now been mostly forgotten by younger generation. This is sort of disappearing. They have there's not been any single piece of work or anthropological work, except one work that dates back now from the 80s on all that aspect. So it's something that is slowly and progressively disappearing. And what I'm mainly facing when I really talk about that are forms of denial or ignorance or silence or a wishful position about not to want to know too much. And just to play back what Jason was mentioning about how this is felt on another level, in a kind of on the level and framed by health issues. There are higher rates of leukemia among young children in La Hague than anywhere else in France, and there are sort of regular controversies about what the effect of slow radiation on a very long period can have on population health, but there's not any really strong will to conduct very independent investigation. So all remains, I mean, it's so tagged and tapped, it's so tapped into political and economical dimension that it's very hard to approach it without understanding the whole set of values that are attached to it, especially in France, where nuclear is still an element of French patriotism in a way.
Thank you, Agnes. And I think that what you just said is this idea that this, in a sense, this knowledge about those places from what you've encountered belongs to an older generation can also be a form of an invitation to keep trying to produce knowledge about those places, and for that matter about other nuclear places all over the planet that unfortunately have very, very similar incidents. But I think this is a good note to conclude this conversation, and I wanted to thank you both for your extremely beautiful and insightful contributions. And I will pass it on to Margarita. Thank you, everyone, for this beautiful conversation.
Okay, I'm back. Thank you so much, Kyveli. Just before we move into the final part of the program, which is going to be a performance by Whitespace, I just wanted to give a big thank you to everyone who joined us tonight for the thoughtful questions from the audience. Big thank you to the Sonic Acts team who worked really hard to put this event together, to the technical production team here in the studio for a really smooth live stream, and to Deborah Mora, Igor Dubrek, and Carl Mubarak for the live stream and website design and the beautiful videos that you've seen making their way into the live stream space behind me and also here on this LED. Again, a big thank you to Kyveli, to Jason, and to Agnes for sharing their knowledge, research, and practices with us tonight. I think it was also really beautiful to find these new, as Kyveli said, like these languages and lexicons in which to start to further understand the nuclear and also the relations that we have with it. So thank you for those wonderful conversations and these talks. Just a little reminder, there are free films, which is Crossroads, Uranium Hex, and We Have Always Known the Wind's Direction will continue to play in 1 hour loops until tomorrow at midnight, Central European summertime. And another little reminder that you can get a copy of Ecos, which is a new periodic magazine from Sonic Acts about art in the age of pollution. And the magazine continues Sonic Acts' emphasis on artists and thinkers that propose alternatives to the anthropocentric view that sees Earth and the non-human world as an endless resource. And in that issue, there's also a really wonderful interview that Kyveli did with artist Sarah Canus about hotspots, nuclear legacies, and toxic tours. So you can check out the web shop online for more information about the magazine. And please keep your eye on our newsletter and social media channels because we're going to be announcing the next iteration of the Overexposed Residency, which is going to be open for applications this week. So if that's something that might be interesting for you, kind of keep your eye out. For those of you who've been like kind of with us for the night air events thus far, you've probably seen some of the residents make programs for this event series. So, with all of those thank yous out of the way, I'm really happy to welcome Whitespace to the studio, who are going to be doing a special live thematic DJ set. Whitespace is a sonic dialogue between Casimir Heelgoed and Annie Nopes. Carefully interlaced textures, ambiances, and abstract sounds carve out an intimate oral landscape, drifting between soothing serenity and chaotic collapse. So there'll be a little transition, and then we're going to have this live set. So thank you all for joining, and we'll see you again after our summer break.